Hello and welcome to Motion Graphing Part 1, where we're going to look at just individual graphs. In this video, we're going to talk about position graphs, velocity graphs, acceleration graphs, and there will be a segment in which you can quiz yourself. Sounds great, I know. So first, let's talk about position graphs. The most important thing to do as the first step is always to label your axes. So we know we're going to have a position versus time graph where position is measured in meters and time is measured in seconds. And we always put position on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. So let's look at some patterns and what they mean. One pattern you might notice is an upward trend in your position graph. In this case, you know that whatever is moving is going in the positive direction. You can see here that something started with a negative position, but what matters is that because it's moving upwards, it is moving in the positive direction. Just like this, a downward trend, regardless of where it is on the graph, tells us that something is moving in the negative direction. And lastly, a horizontal line means that something is staying still because it's at a position and its position is not moving as time passes. Now let's look at velocity, and in the same way, we know we have velocity in meters per second versus time in seconds. And just like before, time goes on the x-axis. So we have velocity on the y-axis with meters per second and time on the x-axis. Some interesting velocity patterns would be a positive value, which would mean you're moving in the positive direction. For now, we don't care about the way that the velocity is changing. We just care that we have a positive velocity. So we must be moving in the positive direction. In the same way, a negative value means we're moving in the negative direction. And a horizontal line means that we're staying at the same speed. This does not mean that we're not moving. In a position graph, a horizontal line tells us that our position is not changing, therefore we're not moving. But a velocity graph, a horizontal line only tells us that our velocity is not changing. To continue, we will sometimes see a velocity graph where the line is on the x-axis. This is the only case in which we know that the object is not moving. Not only is the velocity not changing, but it's 0 meters per second. Sometimes you'll see things moving away from the x-axis, whether it's in the positive direction or the negative direction. This means that the object is going faster in either direction. As for the top one, it's going from a small positive velocity to a larger positive velocity. And the bottom one is going from a small negative velocity to a larger negative velocity. The opposite is true when you move towards the x-axis. In that case, you're slowing down. Lastly, let's look at acceleration. Acceleration is in units of meters per second squared, and we know, just like before, that it will go on the y-axis with time in seconds on the x-axis. In this class, we're only going to see constant accelerations. So one example would be having a positive value would mean that the acceleration is in the positive direction. A negative value means the acceleration is in the negative direction. And the acceleration being on the x-axis, or 0, means that there is no acceleration, which tells us that we have a constant velocity. So let's try a few questions. You should pause the video once the question is shown so you can try it for yourself. So the first question is this graph. What does this graph tell you? Now would be a good time to pause the video. When we look at the graph, we see that we start at a positive value, we eventually get to 0, and then we get to a negative value. Regardless of the angle or the curve, which we'll talk about later, we know we have a downward position trend, which tells us someone is moving in the negative direction. Let's try another. In this case, we have this graph. What does this graph tell you? Another good time to pause your video. In this case, we have a negative velocity that is getting farther from the x-axis. And a negative velocity moving away from the x-axis tells us that someone is moving in the negative direction and is getting faster. Let's try one more. What does this graph tell you? In this case, we have a positive acceleration, which just tells us we are accelerating in the positive direction. In the next video, we'll continue with motion graphing, but talk about moving between graphs.